I live among my own people. We're fine. We're fine. Now look, if you would, beginning in verse 14. And he said, what then is to be done for her? Now she had left their presence at this time, and Elisha the prophet is speaking to Gehazi, his servant. And he said, what then is to be done for her? And Gehazi answered, verily she hath no child, and her husband is old. And he said, call her. And when he had called her, she stood in the door. And he said, about this season, according to the time of life, thou shalt embrace a son. And she said, nay, my lord, thou man of God, do not lie unto thine handmaid. You see, Elisha, as well as his servant Gehazi, understood that back during that period of time, for a Hebrew woman to be barren of all children, that was a shameful thing in the eyes of the people in the community and those who were her friends. And so he tells her, all right, I'll tell you what, about this time, and we're not sure exactly what the time was, but he said, when the time comes, when it's right, you will deliver a child. You will have a child. She has been barren for years. Her husband is old. And this prophet is saying, hey, you're going to have a child. And so she tells him, please, 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 don't lie to me about this. Don't get my hopes up. And then all of a sudden, I have no child. Look, if you would, in verse 17. A little time passes between verses 16 and 17. And the woman conceived and bare a son at that season, and Elisha had said unto her, according to the time of life. That which he had promised her is now fulfilled. It has come to pass. Can you imagine what she must have felt having that child being brought forth simply because Elisha the prophet, by the power of God, said, this is going to happen. This is going to happen. Could you imagine the joy that must have been in her heart? I mean, we find joy at the birth of a baby among our own friends. But here's a woman who is childless, has been childless her whole life. And now she has this child. Now, if you would, look at verse 18. Now a lot of years have passed between verses 17 and 18. And when the child was grown, it fell on a day that he went to his father to the reapers. In other words, the son was going out to be with his father in the field. Why? Because harvest was happening. And therefore, he was old enough to be of at least some assistance. How old he was, we do not know. But he was old enough to be of some assistance to go out into the field with his father. And verse 20, it says, and when he had verse 19. And he said unto his father, my head, my head. And he said to a lad, carry him to his mother. We do not know just exactly what physical ailment he had. If you read various commentaries on the book of 2 Kings, you will have people speculating all kinds of different health issues, most of which lean towards the idea of having a heat stroke. We really don't know. We don't know. And to speculate won't do us any good. But we do know this, it was a serious issue, because in the very next verse, it says in verse 20, and when he had taken him and brought him to his mother, he sat on her knees till noon and then died. Joy and happiness at birth, sorrow and great sadness at death, especially when it's a young child. Can you imagine the mother sitting there with that child on her knees and watching this son of promise that she never expected to have to begin with, and now all of a sudden that child is taken away from her? I'm sure that there's people in this audience tonight who have stood by a friend, a family member, and you've watched them take their last breath. Next week will be 4.5 years since my wife passed away. I was sitting on the bed holding her hand when she took her last breath. It's a terrible thing. It's a feeling of such great loss. And here, especially a child to a mother. When my wife was diagnosed with cancer, we knew that diagnosis with stage 4 metastatic breast cancer, she had somewhere between 2 and 3 years to live. That all doctors told us that. She lived 2 years and 10 months. But you know what? Even though we knew it was coming, it's hard. It's hard. I've had to do funerals for small children, even babies that were born at birth. When I was in Pennsboro, West Virginia preaching, there was a man who worked for the city, and he did odd jobs. He worked for, if they needed help with the water lines, he helped with it. If picking up the trash, he helped with it. But he was employed by the city. And his son, his son's wife, had twin boys. Jimmy Lee and Timmy Lee Cunningham were their names. They lived for less than an hour. And I did the funeral service for those two babies that had lived for just an hour in this world. You know the heartache. You understand the pain that they were going through. Well, that's what this woman was going through. This is a terrible thing for any mother to have to do, is to watch a child of theirs die. Verse 21, and she went up. Now, if we were there and that had been our child, I probably would have been screaming and yelling and crying, and everybody around would know what happened. Not so with the Shunammite woman. By the way, we don't ever know her name. Her name is never given. She's just simply called a woman or the Shunammite woman. That's it. But notice verse 21, and she went up and laid him on the bed of the man of God and shut the door upon him and went out. And she called unto her husband and said, send me, I pray thee, one of the young men and one of the asses, that I may run to the man of God and come again. Notice, if you would, verse 24. And then she saddled an ass and said to her servant, drive and go forward, slack not thy riding for me, except I bid thee. Basically what is being said here is she's telling this young man, listen, go as fast as you can. Don't you dare slow down. Don't you do anything unless I instruct you. And then, verse 25, and she went and came unto the man of God to Mount Carmel. And it came to pass that the man of God saw her afar off and said to Gehazi, his servant, behold, yonder is the Shunammite. Now, he's looking out, and it's a far distance, it's a long distance, and yet he recognizes the Shunammite woman. And so he said to his servant, that's Shunammite. What's she doing here? Why is she here? So therefore in verse 26 he tells his servant Gehazi, run now, I pray thee, to meet her, and say to her, is it well with thee? Is it well with thy husband? Is it well with thy child? Those are the three questions that matter. Is it well with thee? Is it well with your husband? Is it well with your child? And she answered, it is well. Her child has died. And yet her answer is, it is well. Can you imagine the faith that she must have in this prophet, this man of God? To hide it from her husband, to make haste to go there. And when she gets there and he says, is everything okay? She says, it is well. It is well. She was at peace with what had taken place. Then, notice if you would in verse 27. And when she came to the man of God to the hill, she caught him by the feet. But Gehazi came near to thrust her away. He's trying to keep her away from the prophet. And the man of God said, let her alone, for her soul is vexed within her, and the Lord hath hid it from me, and hath not told me. You see, he knows something's wrong, but God, even though he was a prophet, did not allow him to see what was taking place and why she was there. But he sees that she's extremely upset. She's distraught. She's heartbroken. And therefore, he tells the servant, just leave her alone. Let her cling. Let her cling. Now, I'm not going to read the rest of this, but to go ahead and at least give you the conclusion of what happened. He sends Gehazi back to the house with his staff. And he tells Gehazi, when you get there to the house where the child is, in the room on my bed, you lay this staff on his body. And then, when he gets there, he stretches out, and I'm talking about the prophet of God. When Elisha gets there, he spreads out onto this child on top of him, nose to nose, lips to lips, hand to hand, feet to feet. But the child doesn't come back to life right away. So he gets up and he goes back. And the child coughs, if you will. Sneezed, I should say, 7 times. And then the child opened his eyes. This shouldn't surprise us, because if we remember anything about Elisha, we would remember that he was a student, so to speak, a follower of and a helper of the great prophet. Who? Elijah. Absolutely. And Elijah himself had raised the widow's son from the dead. And so therefore Elisha is doing the very same thing that he had seen with the prophet of old, the one who had trained him. The one who had trained him. And you can read about that back in the book of 1 Kings in the 17th chapter. Now, I want us to get to these 3 questions and how they apply to us today. Is it well with thee? Is it well with thy husband? Is it well with thy son? If I would ask somebody today, is it well with you? I'd get all kinds of answers from people. Some would say, well, no, I'm not well at all. I have all kinds of problems. Others would say, yes, things are going great. And I'd ask them, well, okay, if they're going great, what do you mean they're going great? Oh, well, we've got a nice house to live in. We've got a new car, and we've got this, and we've got that, and we can go on vacations, and You see, it depends upon the standard you're using to determine whether or not things are well as to whether or not you're well. But when we use the wrong standards, we get the wrong answer. We get the wrong answer. He wasn't asking if things were going well at her house. He was asking about her. Is it well with thee? With thee. Is it well with you tonight? Is it well with you? In Calcutta, India. Now, this was about 10 years ago that I saw this article. So I assume that some of the things are still the same. But in Calcutta, India, it is estimated that every night somewhere around 75,000 sheep sleep in the streets of the city. They just wander in and sleep in the streets. Also, there are many homeless who sleep in the streets. And they say that every morning people get up, and especially the merchants, and have to go chase the sheep out of the streets so that commerce can begin. But while some are chasing the sheep out of the streets, others are paid to take carts and go around and collect the dead bodies of those who had died, many of them from starvation. There's all those sheep, and they die of starvation. They die of starvation. It's not well with the people in Calcutta, India. It's not well with the people in many of the cities today in the nation in which we live. We have many homeless also. We have many who have great trials and tribulations in their life. And oftentimes we isolate ourselves from those individuals. Why? Because things are going good for us. And we don't want to look sometimes. I know that here within, the last several days that there have been areas close by here that have been flooded. And many people I know have have had a lot of difficulty and a lot of problems because of the floods. And I am thankful that as I look on Facebook with some of the people that I know, I'm thankful that the people in this area, especially members of the body of Christ, have come to their aid. Why? Because they know it's not well for those people. And they want to do something about it. And that's good, because we should do that. We need to help people who need our help. But brethren, there is no greater help needed by any individual than to hear the message of salvation in Christ Jesus. There is nothing more important than that. And we need to help them when they have problems with their physical lives. But we must not do so at the neglect of their spiritual welfare. Their spiritual welfare. You know, wealth comes and it goes. Remember the rich man and Lazarus? You're talking about two opposite extremes. Lazarus was a poor man who was a beggar. He was covered with sores. He would have liked to just had some crumbs that fell from the rich man's table, and dogs came and licked his sores, and that's the only comfort that was ever given to him, was dogs licking him. The rich man fared sumptuously. He had all kinds of wealth and possessions. But then just like that, death comes. The rich man lifts up his eyes in hell, in torment, in Hades, I should say, in torment. Why? He had not prepared for his death. He had not prepared for it at all. But that poor beggar who could only get comfort from dogs licking his sores, he was in Abraham's bosom. You see, it only took that, just a split second, from life to death to change everything. To change everything. And as we go out into the world today and we talk to people, we have no idea whether that will be the last time anybody is able to talk to that individual. We never know. We never know. I remember one time I had a home Bible study set up with a person that I've been trying to get a study with for a long time. The couple were a good, moral people. They were good people, no doubt about it. But they were lost. And the day that I had set up that Bible study, one of them was killed in an accident. And shortly after, the other one moved back to be with family. I never got to study with them. Never. I don't know whether they would become Christians or not. I have no idea. But I know I lost the only opportunity I had. I know that. And that weighs on your mind and on your heart when you understand what is going on. How can it really be well with us? It can only be well with us when we have opened our heart and our minds to the truth concerning the gospel of Christ. It can only be well with us of attitude. But I do know this. Jesus told the people, if you love me, keep my commandments. One of those commandments was to go out and to reach the lost. So we need to do that if it's going to be well with us or with thee. Secondly, is it well with thy husband? Today we would say, is it well with our spouse? Because it goes both ways. It's not that the husband is more important than the wife. In this instance, it was the husband that was behind, and he was inquiring of the wife, is it well with your husband? Is it well with your spouse? God has always demanded that we have concern for others, not just for ourselves. Have you ever met somebody that you believe with all of your heart was just completely absorbed with themselves and didn't seem to care about anything else or anyone else? I'm thankful I haven't met many of them, but I have met some. God requires that we have concern for others. Back in the very beginning, Adam and Eve, when they had those two sons, Cain and Abel. You see, Cain should have been concerned about his brother. Instead, Cain did what? Killed his brother. Why? Because he offered the sacrifice that God demanded, whereas Cain offered one that was not acceptable to God. And therefore, what did he do? He took out his anger on his brother. On his brother. We can also take a look at Noah. Noah is called what? A preacher of righteousness. A preacher of righteousness. He was to be concerned about the masses around him. And he preached, and he preached, and he preached, and he preached for years and years and years and years. But you see, he was concerned. Did any other than his family respond? No. But he did what he ought to do. Brethren, oftentimes when we go to people, they won't accept what we have to say. They will reject what the Scriptures say. It happens. It happens. But our responsibility is to make sure that they at least hear the truth. They have the opportunity to hear it. Remember Jonah? Jonah was supposed to go to the city of Nineveh. They were a wicked, terrible people, a heathen people, and a very, very, I guess we could say, a people who love to inflict pain on others. And so Jonah did what? Instead of going to Nineveh, he got on a boat and went in the opposite direction. In the opposite direction. I remember one time I was teaching a class of young kids, and I was telling them about this story about Jonah and the whale. And I said, do you remember how Jonah finally made it to where he was supposed to go? And one little boy said, yep, God gave him a submarine ride. Well, that's not far from the truth, is it? That's not far from the truth. It was underwater. He was in the belly of that great fish. But he finally went. But you know what? I believe if somebody were to ask me, who's the unhappiest man in the Bible? I think it's Jonah. I do. He didn't want to go to begin with. And he went there and he preached, and guess what? The whole nation repented. And he was upset about it. He wanted to see God strike them dead. He wanted to see God just bring down fire from heaven and just destroy all of them. And he even asked God to do that. He hoped God would change his mind. So he was up on the side of a hill and watches, hoping God will change his mind. So he wanted to be there to watch. And then he got hot. So God brought up a gourd, a plant, to give him shade. Well, that made him happy. And then God decided, okay, that's enough. So he cut the gourd down. Now he's unhappy again. He wasn't happy from beginning to end. From beginning to end. Why? He had no real care or concern for those people. For those people. Brethren, we must never act like Cain or like Jonah. We need to be like Noah. We need to reach out. You know, turn over, if you would, to the book of 1 Peter for just a moment. Go back to the book of 1 Peter and notice what it says in the 3rd chapter, verses 1 and 2. Peter said, likewise, ye wives, be in subjection to your own husbands, that if any obey not the word, they may also without the word be won by the conversation of the wives. Now that word conversation, where it says conversation of the wives, is not talking about their speaking, it's their manner of life. Their manner of life. They had already talked to their husbands, and now they are living their lives in such a way they are portraying what a Christian wife ought to be. While they behold your chaste conversation coupled with fear. Now, don't think that Peter left the husbands out of this. If you would, go on now and read in verse 7. It says, likewise, ye husbands, dwell with them according to knowledge, giving honor unto the wife, as unto the weaker vessel, and as being heirs together of the grace of life, that your prayers be not hindered. Husbands, if we are not the kind of husbands that God would have us to be, it hinders our prayers when we pray to God. We need to understand that. We need to really understand that as husbands. I know it says there, the weaker vessel. I got to tell you this about my mother-in-law and father-in-law. Blake and Lesta Wells, both of them are gone. But I would go there, and those two had been married for, well, better than 55 years. And they always showed care and concern for one another, but they joked around with one another. And they would sit there on the couch. Both of them loved to drink coffee. And one would say, I'd like to have some coffee. And just sit there. And the other would say, I'd like to have some coffee. Just sit there. And finally, my mother-in-law would turn around and look at her husband and say, now, honey, remember, the Bible says, I'm the weaker vessel. So you go get it. Well, that's a misuse of the scriptures, all right? But what it is showing is they cared about one another. They were concerned about one another. And I would hope that any husband would be concerned about the welfare of their wife, not just physically, but also spiritually. And that any wife would be concerned about the welfare of her husband, not just physically, but spiritually. Wives, if you have a husband that's not a member of the church, or husbands, if you have a wife that's not a member of the church, you say, what can I do? Well, number one, like we said yesterday morning, pray. Pray. The fervent prayer of a righteous man availeth much. So we need to pray. We need to plead. Now notice, I'm not saying harass. I'm saying plead. When we have the opportunity to make the point, listen, I'm concerned about you. I want you to understand. Try to get through any way you can. But probably one of the greatest things that you can do is to live a godly